Hey guys, welcome back to Houdini Who Don't Know Season 2, Episode 2. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create what we see on the screen now. It's basically layers of paper simulated to look like a flower bloom. I think you can tell the inspiration is from Windows 11's wallpaper. That entire project is done by the guys at 6 and 5 and I think they do really beautiful work. Hopefully in this video I can show you guys some of the techniques that perhaps can inspire you to also create your abstract paper sculptures. Just a little bit of theory. Let me just do a little quick sketch of what we're going to achieve. It's like this flower bloom, right, where there are many layers of paper that has been formed together. So if we kind of like zoom out and imagine what could be the setup on the outside, it's actually maybe a bunch of papers that has been pinned right in the center of the source. Maybe it's a piece of paper like that, and we can throw some upward forces so that it blooms into this position like this. And instead of one piece of paper, we have multiple layers of paper. So what we could do is to stack maybe 5 sheets of paper like that. And then we can constrain all the center points and then run an upward force. Let's explore how to do that step by step. So firstly, we will create a line and resample the line to say have 5 points or however many points this is. And onto these points, we'll copy a piece of grid, something like that. For each piece of paper, we will make a copy onto each point using the copy to points node. So maybe something like that. Once we are done with that, we could configure this whole piece of geometry as a Vellum configure cloth. And inside that node, we could pin all the center points over here, perhaps to group them up with the selection like that. So I'll draw a selection. So yeah, we could group the selection up like this. We would then plug this all into a Vellum solver, optionally give it a ground plane, and then dive into the solver and drop down a pop wind or a pop force, depending on whether we want some air resistance. And we can define the upward Y velocity or Y wind to be of a certain strength. And also we should increase some noise so that there's a generally undulating noise pattern to create the very nice folds that we can see. I think that's all the theory. I just thought maybe if I explain it visually, you guys can follow along. Here is Houdini launched. There is this empty setup node. I can dive in and we are in the geometry context. And I have also a default render cam with a null. You can ignore that for now. So let's dive into the setup node, and there's nothing over here. So I'm going to drop down a grid, and this grid defaults to 10 units by default. So I'm going to drop down a transform node and size it down to 1/10 of the size, 0.1. And this sits nicely in the 1x1 grid. And next, I'm going to drop down a UV unwrap just to give it some UVs in case I need to texture it. So you can hit spacebar 5 to see that it has been created. And I can turn down the spacing to 0 so that I can maximize the use of these UV coordinates. And next, I'm gonna create the line as explained. So drop down a line node, place it at the side. And this line node defaults to 0 to 1. If I use the copy to points node to copy my first input onto the points on my second input, I only get 2 copies because on line 1, it basically has only 2 points if I turn on my point display. So I can drop down a resample node and wire it in between line and copy the point's second input. And here I can define how many points I want. So I'm going to uncheck the default maximum segment length parameter in order to use the maximum segments method instead and type that I want just 5 points. With that, I will get 5 planes over here. So let me turn off my point display. And also it's a little bit too tall, too high of a setup. So I'm gonna go to my line here and move this down to say 0.25 and maybe 0.125. Okay, so I'm good with that. And let me just change my background color to something like the default. And for now, I don't have to look at my UVs. So I'm gonna uncheck that viewport display and also uncheck my grid. So the next step is to configure this as a cloth. So hit tab, type Vellum configure cloth. A quick tip is to only type the initials VCC and change my overall timeline to 100 frames because that's all I want to simulate. Don't forget to turn on the real-time toggle over here, the one that looks like a little clock. And hit Ctrl up to go to the first frame and hit up to simulate. And sorry, I haven't not dropped down the Vellum solver, so let me do that now. Click on the first output over here and hit tab, type Vellum solver. And there we have it. It automatically wires it in for us and put the display flag on the Vellum solver. Hit Ctrl up and up again to simulate. And it falls through the ground because we didn't turn on the ground position. So that's on the solver settings, turn on ground position. Just as personal preference, I like to go to the Visualize tab and turn off Show Collision so that I don't get distracted by the infinite ground plane. Hit Ctrl up and up. So now it collides with the floor like that. So that's not very interesting. Let me dive into the solver here and drop in some pop forces like pop wind and wire it into the force tab here. And if I run the simulation again, nothing much happens. But if I, on my noise tab, turn on some amplitude, I can get some noises here. And it's not very strong, so I'm going to use a value of 2. So that's a little bit more interesting. And I'm going to use the swirl size of 0.5 to hopefully get more detail. Basically, it's a frequency that undulates every half a Houdini unit if I set it to 0.5. Okay, and next I need an upward motion. So on the wind velocity here, I'm going to type 2 on the y-axis. So this would generally move upwards. Okay, so there are two things I want to fix now. One is I want a variety of colors on my plane here so that I can use the attributes for shading later on. So let me drop down an attribute randomize and put it over here onto my points so that each point is randomized and the grid that is copied onto the points will inherit the colors. The next thing I want to fix is the fact that it looks a little bit coarse because there's not enough resolution. So let me drop down a subdivide node over here on a single grid, and that gives me more subdivision. And if I run my simulation now, there is a little bit more detail. That's cool, but we spoke about having the center point in our setup here to be grouped and pinned as the simulation runs. So let's set that up. To do that, I have two options. One, I will do it on my single plane to group the center point as a pinpoint. The other one is I can group on each of the planes over here. So I'm going to do it the more convenient way, I think, is to group the center point here. So let me drop down a group node just to establish a group membership. I'm going to call this group pin, and I'm going to set its group type to point, and the group name shall be pin. There are a few options over here like the base group, which allows us to click on this mouse selection, go to the viewport, select some of the points we want to pin and hit enter. We could do that, but this is not procedural, meaning if the point ID changes, if I subdivide more times, these points will be some other points. Let me show you. If I go to the subdivide node and change my depth to, well, in this case, it seems to retain the membership quite well. But for a more procedural setup, I would recommend to uncheck this and use the bounding regions method instead. For this, I'm going to go to size down my x-axis and z-axis, copy the parameter, paste it on the z parameter, and just size down the x. So I'm only grouping the center points here. So in this case, if I subdivide, say 5 times, I will still be grouping only the center points like that. I can be really tight about this, something like that. So let me go back to the subdivide node. But you realize that if I go too coarse, then I'm not able to get any points over here. You just have to check that at least one point is selected in the center. So this is good. Let me run the simulation again. But it's still not pinned, and it's not pinned because we did not establish the pinning. There is a convenient way to do this. In the Vellum constraints, there is a pin to animation rollout over here, and in here we can hit the drop down and choose the pin group that we have established. We can only load up this pin group because we created that group membership over here. Before we copy the points, there was one pin group with one member. After we copy the points, there is still one group called pin, but now with 6 members. So the copy the points node automatically inherits the membership of the A stream. I was mentioning that the Vellum constraints node has a convenient rollout for us to choose the pin group here, but I'm going to do this in a more systematic way, which is to create another Vellum constraint node, which is not configured to anything yet, and pop it in between here and set its type to pin to target. The pin type I want is points, and I can choose my pin group here. So this allows me to momentarily, very quickly turn off this node over here. And also I have some additional options should I need to control that inside the solver. This should be pinned now, so let me hit Ctrl up and up again. So you can see that it's all pinned over there. And it doesn't seem to retain the upward shape as much as I would like it to. So I'm going to just dive into the Vellum solver and turn up the wind velocity by 1 and turn down the noise by 1 so that I get quite a bit more upward motion. Hit Ctrl up and up. Okay, so it's looking great now. One thing I want to do is maybe I could get a little bit more resolution, that's one. And also I would like to establish some thickness. So the first one is easy. Hit Shift W, the tessellation that I have now, and increase this to 3. Go to the pins node to check that I at least have 1 point pinned, and I can hit Ctrl up to run the simulation. I would like to get quite a bit more micro folds if I'm able to. And in order to get all the micro folds, I would definitely need to increase my subdivision once more, and on top of that I can lower my cloth configuration's bend stiffness. So if I hit my Vellum cloth constraint over here, and on my bend it defaults to 0.0001, I'm just gonna be slightly greedy and drop 2 levels down to include 2 more zeros in the decimal place and see if I get a little bit more wrinkles and micro folds. So increase my resolution to 4. So I'm getting really greedy now, and let's just see what this looks like. This looks like slow, but maybe it'll be worth it. So I'm getting some really nice folds here, but I do wonder if I can increase my noise amplitude here and decrease my sole size once more. And maybe reduce my wind velocity by 0.5. It's getting a little bit strong, there's quite a bit of stretch. So let me attempt this once more. So let's have a look at what this looks like. So over the course of 15 frames, it has gotten this shape over here, which can look quite nice. I can be really cost efficient about this and only simulate 15 frames, because what I can do is I can retime what is frame 1 to 15 to frame 1 to 100 using the retime node. Retime. So I will choose by frame from what is 1 to 15 as my input frame range. Go to frame 1, break the connections by hitting Ctrl Shift, click in the field here, and set a key frame on frame 1 for the frame parameter to be 1. Alt click, that sets a keyframe, and on frame 100 I will set that to 15, so it will attempt to pick up frame 15 of my input. With that, if I plug it in like this, it will basically help me interpolate frame 1 to 15, even though I didn't simulate all the frames in between. It's a linear interpolation, so we might see some artifacts in that maybe some layers will come through before the other ones. But if we see it from the side view, we might be good with this, because this is a major cheat, inventing another 85 frames of the 100 frame timeline. So if I don't interpolate between the frames, then it will be sort of like a linear motion. You can see it morphing from frame 1 to 2 to 2 to 3 to 3 to 4. And maybe it's not noticeable, and I could work with this. I'm going to shift click inside the frame, and I also have a little curve to play with, so I could ease my animation into it and perhaps start a little bit stronger like that. So I'm going to choose a frame something like this as my hero angle. I think this would be good. Let me now drop down a null node to export this geometry to our OBJ context, out_bloom. Out of habit, I color this green and select the null node, copy it, go to the OBJ context, drop down the geometry node and call it bloom, dive inside, hit the object merge, drop down an object merge node and paste that null over here, and there we have it. So now the setup node is as usual not shown, but we have an object in our scene now which we are going to render. So with the bloom geometry created, head over to the Redshift OBJ context, tab over here, hit the tessellation tab, turn on enable tessellation and enable displacement just in case we might use it. Hop over to the render cam which I've prepared here and click on this padlock to lock my viewport to the render cam, select my bloom node, hover over the viewport and hit spacebar F to frame the object and find the angle that I was happy with. Next, I'm going to frame it in such a way that it's aesthetically pleasing. So I'm going to change my camera focal length to a value of 120 and just move it downwards like that. So the simulation will move like this. So I'm going to hop over to render this now. Switch over to the Redshift render view tab and hit play. That should kick off the render. And there we have it. We need a light, so I'm just going to drop down the RS light dome and hop over to pick up an HDRI texture, turn off the background, just render this, and it's quite a strong light. Let me rotate it so that I can get a nice sculpt on the form. Okay, so this is quite cool, and we need some thickness onto this piece of cloth here. So let me dive into the setup node. After the retime, I'm gonna drop down a Vellum post process. This node allows you to, in one checkbox, extrude each face by the p-scale value that was defined by the Vellum configure cloth. So now I'm gonna hit render again. So now these pieces of cloth have thickness. The light is still a little bit strong, so I'm gonna the light tab here and change my exposure of my light to -1 to step down by 1 exposure stop. And next I'm gonna prepare the material. So I'm hopping over to the material context here, material, and hit tab and drop down Redshift material builder, and I'll call this bloom and assign bloom onto my geometry like that in the viewport. Switch back to the render view and it should be the bloom material. Next I'm going to drop down a Redshift point attribute node. So this is the part where I can pull the color diffuse attributes and plug it into surface over here to see what I have, and there is no point attribute here, and that's because when we started the render it didn't export the CD attributes because it wasn't connected. If we happen to connect new attributes after we have started the render, we will need to restart the render. So let's hit the stop button and start the button again. That's where we can see our color diffuse attributes. And so we can use the standard material. I'm just going to give it some subsurface scattering by turning off the diffuse first and heading down to subsurface and turn on the subsurface scattering and reduce the scale to 0.1 to allow less light, or 10 to allow more light to pass through. But it's not very obvious now because there aren't any colors, so I'm going to just drop this into MS color, restart the render. It appears to be letting quite a bit of light to pass through, which is why everything is still white. So I'm just going to reduce my scale to 0.01 and 0.001, and that's where we get the colors in. I will save this image now and attempt to do one more 0. So with one more 0, it almost looks like it's diffuse. Let me try one more 0, and that's where it really looks like the diffuse shader. So with one less 0, just 3 zeros in between, maybe 0.0003 would give me a good result of the amount of light I want to pass through these pieces of cloth. Maybe a little bit more light. Okay, and we don't have to use the colors as is because once you have randomized color diffuse attributes, we can remap those values into the custom values that you want. So you can do that by using the RS ramp node and just plug in between the current connection, and you can choose your colors now. So we can do the classic complementary colors from blue to orange, and it automatically puts some purple in between. So let me squeeze down the ramp. Looks kind of nice. And even on my orange here, I'm just gonna range it to a less saturated orange, so there's some variance, and maybe push this slightly to the green side and also lower the saturation. So what this allows me to have is hopefully a variety of colors. I can play with the noise sliders. Okay, next I'm gonna give it a backdrop. You can spend the time to tweak this however much you like. You can also drop down the texture, so I'm gonna do that now using the RS texture node. And every time you want to use the texture for displacement or normal maps, you have to set the color space to raw. I'm picking up a normal map over here, so I'm gonna set the color space to raw, and I'm gonna interpret the normal map using the bump map node as a tangent space normal, and then plug this into the bump input here. So we don't see it because when we started the render there was no file texture, and so it didn't export the UV attributes. So let's stop the render and start it again. We can now see the texture over here. But usually bump maps and normal maps wouldn't be very obvious once we introduce some level of subsurface scattering. It's very subdued, but we can still see it, and I think I will have to increase the frequency by a factor of 3. There we can see the effect over here. Sometimes to mimic the fabric effect, we want to use the sheen over here. So let me turn off all notions of the subsurface scattering to explain this. If I use my reflection module and turn up the roughness to 0.5, I can see that this is plastic looking roughness. If I turn that whole module off and use the sheen module instead, turning up to 1, this is how cloth might look like. It's basically the Fresnel tangential area where the light grazes the model, mimicking some level of like fabric and pitch fuzz or some tiny loose threads on the cloth surface. This is just a mimicking effect. If you're going super up close, then you don't have to do this. But some creative use of something in between might be nice. So I'm just gonna use half of this amount and perhaps spread out the sheen a little bit more and use in conjunction with the reflection module. Something like this. Okay, let me bring back my subsurface scatter. And let me experiment with having more like pass through. So maybe twice the current amount. Oh, that's not nice. I'm losing the colors. So I'm going to keep that. And there's anisotropy that I can use. So it's a value of 1 to -1. -1 seems nice. It pronounces the effect when a bunch of stuff are layered onto each other. It blocks out quite a bit of light while it retains the backlight passing through it. So I'm just going to go for -1 here. And I would like to use some level of camera blur. So I'm going to go to my Redshift options here, hit on the cogwheel, and go down to optical and turn on bokeh, and hit on my click to focus gizmo. Click on the area I want to focus, say here, and then just lower the aperture to 1. And you can see it's a little bit too aggressive, so maybe just 5.6, because I do want to keep everything fairly sharp. It's just that I would like to have some noticeable feeling of a camera in the space. So maybe this is healthy and enough. And optionally, if you're not going to bring this to comp, you can bloom this directly in Redshift by turning on the bloom and lowering the bloom threshold. That's where you get a slight bloom in your image. And maybe I'm just going to render this directly in camera. So I'm going to drop down the grid, rotate it by 90 degrees, and move it backwards by 5 units. Stop and start the render to see the effect. Let me hop over to the scene view to see what's going on. Okay, so from my camera, let's have a look at where the camera is. I should rotate the grid by this amount and move it backwards by this amount. Let me create another material, Redshift material builder for my grid. So previously I did a drag and drop to assign the material. Let me show you a variant. Select the grid object, go to render, and under the material parameter, choose Redshift grid. So for now, there's just a black material, and let me increase the roughness. There is a new Redshift function that I can use to make sure that I get a background for free. So let's go over here to background, turn on the checkbox. It only allows a solid background, and that's fine. So let me just pick a color, maybe something like this. So I've just prepared a very rough background like that with a temporary screenshot in place. Now I'm gonna just select my subject matter and attempt to content aware fill this away. Doesn't look too bad. Maybe blur this by 100 pixels. And yeah, maybe that's good enough for my background. Just make sure it's HD, and I'll save it out. Copy this directory, head over to here, and if I hit here now, I can go to image and source for my prepared background, and the color space should be invert ASUS 1.0 SDR. Okay, let me revisit my retime option here, because I have done my retime without consideration of the framing. So now that I have the framing inside here, let me try to make some considerations on that. So I think there are too many frames from the whole start of this that has nothing going on. So let me adjust front of this animation to be quite a bit faster. So it goes like, and it slows in towards the end here. And also I'm just going to create some camera rotation. It's quite slow to play back the extruded surface. So what I can do is to momentarily disable the Vellum post process, so that's quite a bit faster. And I can rotate my camera from the world center by -5 units to 5 units. So this should give me some subtle rotation, which is all I need. Linearize this, maybe just -10 to 10. That could be nice. Okay, so I've spent some time in silence just tweaking the materials and stuff like that. And so we are here, and I will run you guys through again how this was set up. Just very quickly, the node tree is only this big. We created a grid, scaled it down so that it's 1 by 1 world units, gave it some UVs, you can tell over here, and subdivided the grid to have a lot of subdivisions. And we pinned using the gizmo here to create a membership of a center point. This then inherits into the copy the points node, which is copied onto the points based on the line over here, which has been set to have 5 segments, which means 6 points. And we attribute randomized the colors of the points, which gave us these colors over here, which we can randomize further again in shading. And we created the Vellum configure cloth, which establishes the cloth properties. Inside the bend stiffness here, we lowered it by 2 decimal places. And then we used a separate Vellum constraint, set it to pin the point group, which we established over here. And in the Vellum solver, we created a pop wind with some noise in here, and also an upward force of 2.5. With that, we only simulated the first 15 frames because it was taking quite a while and we already arrived at a nice shape that we want, so we don't need all the frames at the end. We should probably cache this. So then we retimed the simulation to frame 1 to 100, and we put a curve onto there to make sure it goes fast and then it slows in, and it never ever tapers off in energy, so that's why I kept the slope over here. But it gives us this dramatic effect. And we placed the camera and animated a slight rotation on it. Honestly, it looks quite cool even from afar, so I might just make a vertical version of this. And finally, after the retime node, we drop down the Vellum post process and just check the extrude by thickness checkbox. And that's where we have the geometry that we need to render. And we drop down a null node to export the geometry into the OBJ context. You might be tempted to turn on this display, and I think for simpler scenes you can, but I highly encourage you guys to get used to this workflow where you use the setup node to create a bunch of stuff. And let's just say you have a bunch of null nodes over here. You can then select them all and export them using a script, which I'm going to show you sometime later in this season, so stay tuned for that. I'm just going to cover a lesson on just building tools to make your process easier in Houdini. So then we exported the bloom geometry. We spent some time shading. Yeah, that's it. I will annotate this entire file every step of the way so that you can refer to it with some sticky notes and stuff like that. And I hope to give you guys access to these files on a long-term basis, and also give early access for people who follow along the content creation of this Houdini Who Don't Know series. I'm looking forward to recording the next episode, because the next episode I'm going to cover something on Instagram that seems to be quite popular. This setup on how to use attributes to drive the simulation. With that, it's Ronald speaking, and I hope to see you in the next lesson of Houdini Who Don't Know. Take care and see ya.